All set? Awesome. Well, thank you, everybody. My name is Jack Herscowitz. I'm really happy to be here. I'm here from Los Angeles, where I've been living for the past 3 years. And I'm giving this talk sort of both as sort of an auto-ethnographic thing, that's a fancy word for just self-reflection and talking about my work, and sort of filtered and looking at a lot of my recent work over the past 3 years through this sort of theoretical lens in relation to the idea of tuning, which is something that has become a through line, not in all of my work, but in a good amount of it, and sort of the ways in which I'm dealing with the history of that, yeah, finding my own thing. So the title of this presentation is Irrational Intonation, Embracing Tuning as Effort, and hopefully by the end of this you'll understand more or less the many ways that I think of tuning as effort. So talking about, tuning, just intonation, all music is dealing with just intonation in some way, right? The overtone series is a scientific way of looking at sound. But I very much come from, a specific tradition. I think the sort of Ben Johnston and James Tenney-esque sort of, the scientific way of looking at it. Also, especially with Johnston, this idea of, having a fundamental and then building out pitch lattices based off of relationships in the overtone series is very much the way that I sort of came into this. And it's important to say, right, because, you think about, like, the pentatonic scale. That's just intonation, right? And that's why so many cultures across the world came to the pentatonic scale, is because the ratio of 3 to 2, the perfect fifth, is very easy to hear. So, JI is everywhere, but this is the sort of tradition in which I sort of came to it. And then you take what James Tenney and Ben Johnston and even Harry Parch were doing, and then the notation system that I've used is the extended Helmholtz-Ellis JI pitch notation by Wolfgang von Schweinitz, who teaches at CalArts, where I did my master's, and Mark Sabat, who is based in Berlin. And they created this really, really nice, usable, extremely practical system where each prime accidental in the overtone series, which every time you get to a prime number, it's a unique partial, right? So 14 is basically the same as 7, but 7 is like the first time that pitch comes in. So every time you're using something that goes down to maybe the 7th partial, you have a very specific accidental that you use. So it's very, very practical way of dealing with these things. You look at Ben Johnston's scores. I don't have any part of the presentation. Totally unreadable, really hard, actually. People play them, but this type of notation makes it very clear what's happening, right? You look at Ben Johnston's score, it's not unreadable, but you have to take some time to really figure out what's happening. And obviously there's other things, I talked about, like, the pentatonic scale all across the world, arriving at the pentatonic scale, overtone music, I think of like Lamont Young. We have a fundamental, we are just exploring the overtones within that fundamental. We're not doing this diasporic wandering elsewhere with the pitch lattices. Ellen Fullman as well, long string instrument, and another amazing composer who deals with these types of things, and spectralism also, which is sort of overtone-inspired music or spectral-inspired music, but it's not sort of about the direct, exact, perfect replication of it. Oftentimes, the 7th partial is approximated via a quarter tone rather than the exact 30 cents flat. So this is just sort of to talk about a little bit. This is where I come from. This is where I came into all of this. But really, why am I interested in this music? And then this is, if you want to see, you can find this online, or I can send you a PDF. This is how they notate the first 63 partials of the overtone series. I think this version is actually like a little bit outdated, but it's like one really high prime that they changed that I'm certainly not using. But yeah, why did I come into this? I think a lot of my interest in tuning actually comes from like a lot of different types of music. I mean, my background actually was jazz. It's not really something I do very much anymore. But I love Coltrane, and Coltrane is actually important for me also because of noise as well, which is a whole nother talk. But he would play 20 cents sharp all the time, wildly sharp at least, all the time, and it's amazing. And it doesn't matter because he commits to it and it sounds great. I think about Daniel Johnston, the singer-songwriter. People call it outsider music, which I don't know how I feel about that term. But it's if you're committing to some sort of intonation for a long duration of time, whether or not it fits perfectly within the tuner, it's really beautiful. And I bring up Tom Waits because I have this story of when I was in undergrad. I was playing Tom Waits for a group of people. If you don't know who Tom Waits is, like one of my favorite composers, singers, best voice ever, if you don't know. I played a little bit, and somebody who had perfect pitch was like, "This is the worst thing ever. It's wildly out of tune." And I was like, "Wow, you are missing the point so much if that is the first thing that you are thinking about." And so the other things that are important to me, Pauline Oliveros, who I won't shut up about, I think about just intonation as lattices, pitch lattices are directional, right? Pauline Oliveros thought of listening as directional. A lot of her sonic meditations, a lot of her text scores really deal with this idea of directional listening. I love her pieces for orchestra because that's what they're about. They're about finding somebody else, and you actually have these sort of invisible webs of listening. So in a way, it's actually really comparable to this approach to JI. And then Brian Ferneyhough, what the heck is he doing here? What I love, and Ferneyhough's a very complicated person who probably a lot of people have very, very different approaches to. I like to have my own idealized what I get from his music, and I'm living in my own world, and that's fine. I love this idea of dealing with something essentially overwhelmingly impossible, and how that, as a task, sort of forces the performer to psychologically engage with this task. And out of that sort of intense dialogue, which my teacher, Michael Pissarro, actually akin to like a BDSM relationship, which you must submit to in a very consensual way. And I really actually like that, talking about Ferneyhough. You must commit to it. And out of that struggle, and out of that very unique power relationship comes something interesting. And how does that relate to tuning? Well, we're doing this oftentimes, and this is what I've started to be interested in, on instruments that aren't necessarily meant to do this. And there's certain instruments where this is much easier. I think strings and brass, the people who are really dogmatic about this, brass is their favorite, strings are their favorite. There's a lot of, a ton of brass music and just intonation. But what does it mean to write a piece for JI with a bassoon? What does it mean to actually, and this is, people can do it. And you submit to it and you figure it out, right? Obviously in a very consensual way. And so that is something that was really interesting to me. And then yes, the last part sort of relates to what I was talking about. We have these instruments not necessarily meant for this, but we still figure out ways to do it. And also, what I'll talk a little bit about more is setting up situations, which I've done a few times, where the tuning is impossible to do. And I know that. And I tell the performers that I know that, but I do it in a way where I'm very clearly communicating that and sort of seeing what comes out of that situation. And so the danger for me with a lot of this music, to put it like really simply, I think of Donna Haraway, who's one of my favorite scholars, has this article about the God trick. And I think the second quote really sums it up. From this point of view, from the God trick, science, the real game in town, is rhetoric, a series of efforts to persuade relevant social actors that one's manufactured knowledge is a route to a desired form of a very objective power. And to put that in the context of this, it becomes very easy for this to become number music. And through, the existence of these perfect ratios which exist in nature, it creates this, it runs this danger of making this feel like this is objective harmony. This validates itself because it comes from, math, which is, math is a very emotional thing, right? It's very much so. Numbers are we talked about this in Max's presentation, or I asked Max this question about numbers having sounds, right? Numbers are very affecting things. And so I see this a little bit in this world. It becomes music about the numbers, music about the harmonies, but what is really, our experience of this music usually has very little to do with the harmonies, actually. So how do I have this sort of non-positivist approach to just intonation? And now I'm going to give you this absolute, complete, hodgepodge sampler of basically 3 years ago when I started doing this to now. So this is sort of my own, this is where the auto-ethnography begins to come in. So I'm actually going to start with the very first piece I ever did with just intonation. It's a piece called Freeze Dry for 3 tubas, all with guitar pedals processed and then amplified out of bass amps. And I bring up this piece just one, because I worked really hard on this recording over the last year, so I want to show people. And two, it shows a start of, this is, would call this overtone music, actually. Really what's happening harmonically is there's just a few fundamentals, and then the competing overtone series for the 3 tubas becomes increasingly tense. And then the second reason I'll talk about a little bit afterwards, but I'll play a little bit from the beginning. It's a 27-minute piece, and a little bit from the end. Which is very different, but not really. piece not only because I like it and worked hard on the recording, but because at the end specifically, and this is something I realized, I have no fear of combining noise with these pitches. And a lot of, the music that deals with this, these harmonies is all about, presenting the pitches in very, very clear ways. And so there was already, even with something where I wasn't even really beginning to think critically, I was just like, oh yeah, cool, the overtone series. Oh yeah, great, tuba multiphonics. There's still this little seed of sort of things that were to come later. And I forgot to mention the tuba player is Mason Moy, who's my really, really good friend, and awesome, played all three parts on this. So let's move on to the next thing when sort of I get a little more critical with the idea of tuning. This is a piece I wrote I brought up bassoon because I worked with bassoon and fixed electronics, placed without language or streets. And so what I was doing here is I have a lot of these like very tightly knit 5-limit intervals, sort of moving. I think I was using like ratios of 5:4, the just third, 8:9, which is basically akin to the major second in equal temperament, and 9:10, which is a little bit narrow and is an interval that I love because it kind of throws things out of whack, and weaving those intervals around itself to get these really, really tough, unique microtones. And so these microtones on bassoon are pretty hard to play. Bassoon is a tough instrument. And so what I sort of realized after the fact, after writing this piece, is there's this interplay between the synthetic bassoon and the real bassoon. And what I realized afterwards, and this is a weird thing to say, is I actually didn't care if they were a little bit off. I actually started to think that it was interesting. And it was a moment of like self-reflection. And I was like, why am I using this hyper-specific notation system if I am okay with it being a little bit off? And so I'll just play a little bit of it. This was played by my friend Lauren Martin, amazing, awesome bassoonist. And there's other things to say about this piece, but I'll specifically talk about this one section in that context. So just to give you a little bit, I'll play a bit. Teases of everything. And so, yeah, so I'm asking myself this question, well, why is that fine? And so what I sort of realized is I'm interested in this attempt at something perfect. And there's times, I think I'm actually more interested in achieving it, especially for, like piece, I'll talk a little bit about my piece for tonight. But there's times like this when there's sort of there's the piece specifically is really, there's this doppelganger between this, what's happening in the electronics and what's happening in the bassoon. And it was something to think about. So for the next piece, which was a large ensemble piece that got premiered a year ago, I was really asking these questions very intently about tuning as effort and what that meant. So I won't get, for the sake of time, too into like the actual composition of this piece. If you know William Basinski, I totally ripped this off, and we could talk about that another time. But let's talk a little bit about the tuning stuff. Moving on, I have invented 2 new accidentals. And you can see the arrow, well, the arrow down, actually, well, people use that for sure, but I use it in my own context. And actually, I think it is in the Helmholtz-Elitz system. I didn't even realize. It's for some higher partial, but I was using it in my own context. And then my favorite thing ever is the question mark accidental. Yeah. And so, what are these 2 moments? So the way that this piece works, and I'll talk a little bit about Basinski, William Basinski and like that album Disintegration Loops, works with loops, tape loops. I took a very simple diatonic chord progression. I am unabashedly in love with diatonic harmony, and I looped it. So this is the 8-bar chord progression. It gets looped, I think, like 30-ish times over the course of the 20-minute piece. And I have all these parameters that I rarely do this, but I mapped them out very specifically to change over time. And one of those parameters was tuning. So it starts in equal temperament. The fundamental is an equally tempered E flat. And then very gradually, we start adding 5-limit intervals. Then we start adding 7-limit intervals. And then we add funky 5+7 limit intervals that just totally sound off, actually. And then we have the arrows coming in. And so what the arrows are asking, and this is where, you know, the stuff with Fernie Howe and impossibility, you know, Fernie Howe might actually be possible. This is actually impossible. I asked the lowest person voice in the chord to just randomly detune anywhere from 10 to 30 cents from the written pitch. And then everybody else has to read that person's mind and maintain the given frequency ratio with them. So obviously that's not possible. And the players were great. They got that immediately. But what you get is just this funky, sort of nebulous thing. And I think it's really beautiful. And so by the end, we're sort of in this world, and then we actually sort of fade to noise. And then the question mark accidental comes in at the very end, I think. So this is sort of where the arrow accidentals sort of come in. You can see the bass flute is flattening, and then the bass clarinet has to read their mind and flatten as much as they're flattening. And then there's this noise coming in. The end of the piece is a bass flute solo where the question mark accidental. They are allowed to play anywhere from 50 cents sharp to 50 cents flat from the given note. And sort of what I actually treat this as, and this is when the piece ends, is this kind of litmus test of how, from an audience perspective, how do you hear this? Do you hear this as out of tune? Do you hear it as in tune? What's happening? And the thing that I did, that it was the only time I've ever done this, is the whole solo is a 12-tone row. And so it's actually a recontextualization. And I think that's interesting because when I talk about, you know, this critique of number music justifying itself, I mean, serialism is sort of the perfect example. And I would rather be a Webern than a Babbitt. Sorry to throw him under the bus. And so, yeah, and you know, nobody, it was interesting to talk to people afterwards. Nobody perceived this as a 12-tone row, and no one perceived this as out of tune. It just was a sort of moment in the piece. And it's a 20-minute piece. I obviously can't play all of it, but I'm going to click through and just sort of give a little taste of like the general progression of things. And this is 14 musicians. conversational and it's skipping around, but here's the bass flute solo. That doesn't give the whole picture, but it gives a little taste of it. And then what's happening, if I didn't talk about it with all the paper crumpling, is that's basically my version of, static or some version of that. It's a similar thing to earlier. The pitch and the noise all connected, and I don't want to just present the pitches by themselves, at least in this piece. So it sort of ramps up. They use louder materials by the end of the piece, and it basically overwhelms the sound, sort of like similar to Basinski, a tape loop disintegrating. Cool. And then, there we go. I'll talk just briefly about this piece. We're not going to listen to the recording because we did a sort of pop-up DIY concert in like an abandoned water tank in the desert in the middle of a very windy night. So you can hear the wind rattling like a piece of metal on the tape. It was a beautiful life experience, not great documentation, so we'll do a studio recording later. This is a piece that I can't talk about without talking about James Tenney's Koan for solo violin, which is a piece that totally changed the way I thought about things. It's just one gradual glissando, essentially, that explores the entirety of the spectrum between, the space between pitches, right? These type of just intonation we're thinking about as we get higher up in the overtone series, smaller spaces, right? The interval of 16 to 17 is smaller than 15 to 16. But this is exploring the entire spectra in between. And so someone else that I was really thinking about with this is Eliane Radic, who I love. And the way that oftentimes, she performs with these synthesizer pieces is this idea, and I'm an electronic musician, that's my sort of primary performance practice, turning just the knob so slowly to sort of explore all of these gradient spaces between two ideas. And so this idea of turning a knob is such a clear indication of the process of tuning. So what I did for this piece is I have this really simple, again, two-voice progression that is played on just the G and the D strings on the violin, and then we have geared pegs. Fortunately, got a grant so that Simone, who I wrote this for, didn't have to buy them because they're kind of expensive. And then what they have to do is very gradually, and my instructions are as slow as possible, while continuously bowing, detune one of the strings so that you get from one pitch to the next one. So we have the effort of tuning literally sonified in this moment, and the entire spectrum, present in the music. And then what we have, which I think is really interesting, are these moments of crystallization, right? Is the moment in which we reach this beautiful 5-4 just major third, and then we feel like we've had this arrival point. So what I'm asking for is a very clear process of listening to somebody tune, and I want that to be presented in the most bare bones, direct way, because for me, if there's more than this, we're not gonna get that. And so it has to be, for me, presented extremely directly in order to hear sort of the intensity and the effort of it all. And then a little side note, because there is some little nerdy stuff here, I throw in a slightly smaller major second to create a comma pump, which means that when we arrive back at this G to D, we're 1 5-limit comma down, so we're a little flatter. And so there's this actually imperceptible detuning that's happening throughout the entire piece, which is not actually really audible, actually, because everything's always relative. So if once you return back to this, but it's a little flatter, you know, it's whether or not you actually perceive that as different pitches is, I'm not actually sure. I don't really, you know, when I'm listening to it, I just kind of hear the progression repeating. So it's kind of interesting for me to hear that. Specifically, and then at last we shall rest for my awesome friend Simone, and then I Miss the Wonder in Infinity for a large ensemble, are the pieces where this idea of tuning as effort, in which you are actively hearing the process of tuning, that process of listening, which it is, to me, sonified, and these, you know, sort of non-musical parameters are hopefully inherent in the music, are sort of where I see this practice most strongly solidified. And so we'll skip all this and talk about my favorite, the piece tonight. I want this actually in tune, for the most part. There's 6 movements, but I will talk about the final movement in which all players basically play harmonies from all the previous movements all at once. And it's impossible to all start on the downbeat together in this moment, but it's a moment where a lot of the other movements are very intentional and direct, and there's a lot of other things happening in this piece that I don't have time to talk about. You start hearing this effort of tuning, as I asked them, and I said in the, you know, in the notes and actually in rehearsal, is that you can adjust a little bit. And I actually kind of want to hear this solidifying and this changing as well, in addition to this sort of becoming all instruction, which is actually asking the performers to have their timbre match the entire sonic situation, which includes both what is happening on and off of stage. So I very much want these psychological kind of heady processes to come out in performance, and which is kind of an act of faith in a way, but making experimental music is an act of faith, perhaps. And so I have to include this because this is my favorite practice, my favorite slide. All credit to Rage Trombones, awesome trombone duo. Is, you know, I've done all this, but what was I really after at the beginning? And, you know, I go back to Coltrane. You know, tuning can be done in so many other ways, and I go back to the bassoon piece as well. Well, if I'm interested in this imperfection, well, why am I using such a perfect system that's actually meant for this? And so I'm gonna very quickly, I know we're running out of time, just show a few examples in which I just sort of take tuning to a more very subjective feeling. Nothing particularly scientific. There's no relationship to the overtone series in a direct way, or any of these, you know, the Helmholtz-Ellis system. But I still consider it in this same train of thought, actually, even though they may seem different. This is a duo I did with organ. The sine tones are basically partials of what the organ is playing, and just randomly moved. And I think it sounds nice. So it's just rehearsal clip. This very quickly. I don't think we have time for. I'll play a little bit of this. This is my sort of improv duo, voice and electronics, with my my partner and amazing vocalist, Abigail Whitman. And oftentimes what I'll do is I'll live sample and then just like move those samples, time stretch them and pitch shift them, but in a very, I'm thinking about filling out the spectrum rather than pitch. So what I get is these just like weird intonations that I actually like, I can't control. And I've been doing this for a while, and it sounds great, you know? And you just sit in it, especially, you know, with the pitch material, and it ends up working always. And so I'll just play a little bit. This is from an upcoming album that we just finished mixing. Quickly play. I know I love just like giving little teasers of things, is solo performance karaoke of Dreams by the Cranberries. I call it a karaoke because I think that's what it is. And I won't talk too much more about it, but this goes back to, you know, if you commit to something in any sort of tuning, whether that be very hyper-specific or extremely amateurish, you can make it. It's interesting regardless. And so I'll play the beginning of this so you get the sense of the karaoke and then where it ends. It's gonna get loud, so just heads up. Sorry. I'll skip the beginning. Well, I already spoiled it, so here's the end. Oh, no, what happened? There we go. So when there's a way, there's, oh, sorry. There's a total through line between this and the just intonation music, actually. And it's sort of this effort and this recognition that tuning is ultimately a sort of this culturally relative thing. And if anything, that's really what I'm interested in, is thinking about it as contextual. So great. Thank you, everybody, for listening. Cool. Questions? Yeah.
I wonder if you could maybe talk a little bit about your relationship to timbre as well as pitch, kind of just thinking about, there are two particular bits are two particular regions I was thinking about. So one is that when you're dealing with kind of the overtones, or so that any particular instrument kind of it's got like a series of different pitches involved. Particularly think about that ensemble piece you did where we had like really lovely like double reed sounds, really, really beautiful. And then contrasting that with like the noise element. So when you're thinking about the just intonation thing, is timbre something that you're really concerned with or not?
Yeah, generally when it comes to timbre, I try to create like a hyper instrument, actually. And that's what I was trying to do with the large ensemble piece, was create this kind of hyper instrument that it was kind of this very tightly knit harmonies that really tried to blend. I actually think about like big band music when I think of orchestration, because it's like my favorite large ensemble writing. And I think a lot of the big band's a really nice hyper instrument for me. And then having it slowly break apart. And there was something similar in the bassoon piece also, because there's kind of this hyper instrument between the electronics and the bassoon. So generally, blend is my goal when it comes to timbre. And that's actually especially true in the piece for tonight, which is actually all about blend and timbral blend. It's actually probably more essential to tonight's piece than the tuning itself, actually. Does that answer?
Yeah, great.
Thank you.
At the beginning of the lecture, I was thinking, I don't know anything, or I don't know anyone who have tried to do this with, for instance, wavefield synthesis. Do you know anyone who is trying to adjust intonation to do it physically in the space?
I'm not totally sure. I bet there are folks, though.
Because, yeah, that would be, probably you can create different things.
My friend, actually. My friend has done this.
With wavefield synthesis?
It kind of, but like just intonation in the space,
right,
sort of inspired by
where
wave.
you can really control what goes in space, time, domain.
Yeah, and can feel it. It was like just like a quadraphonic thing. It wasn't the full-on wave
No,
feel,
I'm
but it
talking
was
about,
inspired.
like, having the room covered with speakers in one.
Yeah. I don't know
anybody.
anybody.
But the one that is just in one level. There are very few of them.
Yeah, I don't know anybody. I mean, I know they have one at like UCSD, so maybe there.
No, it's just...
That's a good question. I wish I knew.
Thank you for the talk. I really love it. I want to ask about like if there have been any feelings or questions for you in regards to like any associations of just intonation with like not religion or a specific religious tradition, but maybe religious or pseudo-religious processes and practices, just because it's a very like even the term perfect and within an interval context and striving for perfection and spending hours and hours of ritualized time within one's own life aiming towards a certain internalized and then externalized perfection. Like, I don't know, I think there's that very like there's that undercurrent to it, and I wonder if that like creates these like odd feelings of limitations within what you can and can't do almost. I don't know. I'm freestyling.
No, my response to that is actually, I think it relates to the God trick thing, right? It's funny that I use, that theory, and, people become extremely religious, I actually like that word, about this. And that's just not something that I'm interested. It's no different to me than equal temperament, It's just an option. So I try to just like culturally reject it, even though I use it, and just never be so intense about it that it becomes, dogma. I think it has to do with the way that people talk about it also in practice and these extra musical things. But I think it runs that risk for sure. And yeah, it's how do we use these really, they're beautiful harmonies, so how do we use them without just, falling into that trap? Probably just by being nice people.
Thank you. Yeah, and thank you for the openness to like, yeah, I feel as though like, you like by like exploring this path, but also loving the multiplicity of all of these paths, you like, I don't know, it's leaving space in the room, and it's just, yeah,
Thanks.
love.
Sweet. Thank you, everybody.
out of time. At the intersection between an observer or a subject and an object. So we can therefore think of music as a performing art as something temporal. That is, duration is a fundamental attribute of its existence and usually an intrinsic consideration of the composer or author of the work. We can contrast this with static art forms, perhaps, in which an object exists to be apprehended by an observer, but is fundamentally stationary or unchanging at immediate human timescales. I'm going to try and move through this bit fairly quickly because I think it's very similar to how Claudia kind of opened hers yesterday, kind of talking about the difference between art that exists in time and art that exists outside of it. But as two kind of archetypal examples, perhaps, would be a classical symphony and a painting. So the symphony is authored by a composer specifying a certain set of rhythms and pitches, etc., producing a score for musicians to play off, and in doing so you're specifying like a temporal arrangement or a process, essentially notating time. In contrast, the painter places paint or the materials onto a surface, and whilst the temporality of this may have a profound effect on the outcome, the resulting image, once created, the image remains the same, barring, fading, cracking, discoloration, etc., which all take place over timescales that are too long for us to initially comprehend. Therefore, as objects, we can perhaps consider the former, the symphony, to be existing within time, and in the other to be existing outside of it. Despite this, both require a temporal dimension in order to exist as an aesthetic experience, i.e. to satisfy the function of an artwork. In case any of you struggle to imagine what a painting is, I've got some examples here so you can see what a painting looks like in real life. So considering a painting, the eyes may be first drawn to certain facets, perhaps curves, colours or figures, and then moves across the canvas of the work. And in doing so, creates a performance of experience that is composed with each viewing. It would be therefore negligent to think or assume that the static artist has no consideration for this manner of apprehending their work or creating their work with this type of consumption in mind. In spite of this, they lack the carefully controlled curation of time that is generally afforded to the composer. So as the temporal condition of music is so often closely controlled by the author of the work, when one participates in an unfolding of the static artwork, the structure of this in time is predominantly self-led by the perceiver. So we can extrapolate from this to say that an artwork only exists in time, or time only exists for an artwork, through its interaction with participants, that being anyone involved in the perception of a work, audience, performer, creator, viewer, etc. It's this entanglement between the object and the subject from which time emerges as something measurable and experienced. The predominant mode of time that dictates through Western classical music is discrete and external. So this is clock time. Even predating the era of mechanization, railways and factories, becoming a requisite condition of polyphony in particular, and honed through the advancements of Jean-Baptiste Lully, Johann Nepomuk Maelzel, who both centred the role of the conductor and the metronome, respectively. So the woven metrical lattices that this creates have kind of persisted through the evolution of Western music ever since. Accordingly, this limits the musical work to a single trajectory through time, with a single external conceptual clock to which all performers are synchronized. This creates a single homogeneous time for all participants, performers and audience. So we're all sharing in that same sense of time together. Hence, the time surface of the music becomes flat. Time is not something participated in, but instead fixed and dictated prior to the conditions of performance. So music of the Western tradition then often relies on a temporality that is very tightly controlled. With the piece that you just heard before the lecture, The Equivocation of Time, I was beginning to think about alternative methods of organising time, moving towards time that is participatory rather than hierarchical. There's perhaps a tendency to view or define the work we do in terms of what we have control over. This is kind of the fundamental condition on which the author is based. As authors whose public identities are so often closely entwined with the work we're associated with, this presents an incentive to assert ever greater control, to try and pre-think every condition of the work, to exclude as far as possible all that can be considered failure, or to try and shift the burden of failure onto the act of interpretation or performance. So if something just kind of doesn't work in the piece, we can sort of go to the point like, no, that's an F sharp, it's in the score, just do what I told you to do. So trying to kind of remove oneself from that condition where you allow that kind of freedom in the performance. So I think the complexity of composers such as Fernyhough, Dylan or Finnessy are kind of particularly often cited examples of this kind of complexity within the rhythmic or metrical domains. Some examples there. But the same extremes of detail can be taken with any kind of parameter, such as timbre in the post-Lachenmann tradition, or perhaps texture in the saturationist movement. Although those are all quite distinct approaches and all have their own adherents and philosophies, what I believe is kind of shared between them is they try and push further beyond limits of control. Considered in this way, they can be seen as reactions to the mid-century movements that preceded them. If absolute serialism expanded the dominion of parametric control up to its limits, or perhaps spectralism has a similar approach to considering frequency spectra, the movements that came after these seem to move beyond the realm of absolute mastery into a region of disintegration. And perhaps now we can include Jack Herscowitz into that whole kind of paradigm of moving beyond into the realm of disintegration. So the works that they create become sort of unstable objects in which the surface of the music begins to detach from the underlying structure. The conditions of the music cannot be contained within their construction or satisfied according to the sort of the underlying currents of them. Which is not to say that any of these works suffer from a lack of technique, quite the opposite, but that technique is utilised to a threshold of failure and in some way becomes a way of escaping an objective form. These methods can be contrasted with the evolution of the kind of experimental approach that is taken by those like Cornelius Cardew, Christian Wolff, Pauline Oliveros gets another name check this afternoon, and others, who take a radically opposite course, kind of relinquishing and subverting traditional notions of control through collaborative and participatory practices. These reimagine the author's role and relationship between performers and audience and creator. But in a sense, all the approaches share a common facet, perhaps, in that they, in different ways, begin to negate the control of the author over the reception of their work, instead inviting numerous subjectivities to populate them. Whereas one methodology achieves this through a direct, explicit means, kind of removing the classical signifiers of control in terms of notation, pitches, rhythms, even instrumentation from the score. The opposite side takes those same signifiers and intensifies them until they start to break. So returning to the main topic of the lecture, and time, and the notion of music as temporal activity. As composers seek to emancipate time in the structure of the work, one must also acknowledge that time still once again becomes subjugated in its rendering. So when we perform something, we kind of fix it in time. So in approaching time from a non-hierarchical perspective as a composer, one of the first thoughts must be about what it is that governs duration and on what scales you seek to allow that freedom. So Xenakis talks about different sort of scales of time in his essay concerning time, and thinking about the traditional parameters of music. So there is timbre, pitch, rhythm, meter, structural, and kind of possibly durational in the extreme end, and that these essentially exist on a continuum rather than being sort of discrete factors. So as you zoom through the structural layers, this becomes the realm of meter, and then kind of within divisions of the second, it becomes less audible, transferring into pitch and timbre. So what's therefore inescapable with music, and hence the contrast with static art, is the need to organise time according to some sort of schema in order to generate the work. So no musical decision can be made that doesn't on some level involve the shaping of time. So I'd like to briefly discuss two earlier works before elucidating on how I kind of approach that in the piece you heard earlier. So this is just a, not an actual part of a piece, this is a sketch for the central section of a piece called Epiradialis. It's like a formal schematic of metrical contraction. So it's a way of generating a rasterized realization of a measured accellevando, a fancy way of saying it gets faster. And this was used alongside a pitch space lattice to derive the central section of my chamber work, Epiradialis. So what is produced by this is simply one iterization within the bounds of the process. It results in a rhythmically precise notation, despite the fact that that's not strictly necessary for the conditions of the work, or the only way of moving through the metrical space. So this is the actual score itself, so I didn't do all the colours in the previous section, but each sort of line of the schematic kind of corresponds to a colour there. So I'll just play a little bit of, in the bottom corner, a little bit of this. Okay, so this kind of precision becomes problematic when dealing with logistics of performance due to the fact that it's not always clear how to distinguish between the strata of entropy of musical material at site. So this can produce technically challenging realizations of highly entropic material that place demands on performers that wouldn't otherwise be necessary. Simply for the sake of being a precise way of communicating the idea through traditional musical notation. So this small excerpt above was from an earlier work called Herscowitz, kind of the climactic point, and it's an illustration of that tension. So here several overlapping evolutionary processes combine or intersect to kind of trace the boundary conditions of a space within which this realization is notated. So the tension between predetermined criteria and intuitive creative process manifests in the clearly ordered rhythmic and metrical grids within which a random or quasi-random intuitive pitch system is realized. So although the pitch system has its own kind of internal logic to it, what's produced along with the kind of the micro-polyphony of the texture is an effect that's chaotic on the mesoscale, arising from a highly structured mini and macro scale. So that's going back to the terminology Xenakis was using. So essentially this is kind of the product of a stochastic process in which small-scale localized redistributions of material may make no discernible difference to the kind of surface of the work. So that's what I mean by being highly entropic within certain limits. So this realization is highly optimized in some senses, yet difficult to perform in practice. Despite this, a fully notated version is maybe preferable as an easier way for performers to access a sort of a correct version of the music rather than trying to simply define the processes themselves. So I'll let you hear a little bit of that. Okay, so in seeking alternative approaches to time and organisation, I began thinking about subjectivity and perception and the ways in which time is measured or sense of time is created. Taking inspiration from the idea of emergent time, where time is not a fundamental axiom but arises out of participation between units in a system. I arrived at 5 systems of organisation that sort of decentered that universal clock idea, time as measurement, and instead allowed time to be created organically within the work. So therefore, time and events are not pre-measured, although I do specify certain things in terms of duration to kind of assist the interpretation. But it's allowed to form as a result of participation between the performers. Part of what I was also thinking about were the artistic choices that I wanted to make in terms of my own style of music. So I'm quite concerned with layers, interactions, and harmonies, which is essentially counterpoint. This is something I want to kind of preserve in the output of the musical systems that I'm working with, despite the fact that they sort of work at cross purposes to one another. So the inherent non-linearity of these time structural systems naturally weighs their output towards either circularity or stasis, loops or drones. In contrast, harmony as a function is linear and directional. It serves to propel the music forward. So what I'm attempting to do is reconcile this conflict and introduce a sense of directionality into these non-linear systems, or to allow the integration of some manner of counterpoint outside of a strict metrical lattice. So I use the term time organisations or temporal flux kind of interchangeably to describe this. So time, considering time as like the measurement of one state passing to the next, i.e. the exchange of information from a hypothetical future into a recollected past. And flux being the measure of something passing across the boundary. So this terminology reflects my preoccupation with how time is created for the work through a series of different manners of interactions. So I created these sort of 5 different systems: catenary time, contiguous flux, Brownian time, fluvial time, synchronic time, kinesthetic time. I'll just go a bit into each one of them and how I applied them in the work. So catenary time, the term's taken from the idea of a chain hanging loosely between 2 points. The arc made by this physical system closely resembles a parabola, yet is subtly different in form and underlying mathematics. So whereas the parabola has a sort of consistent set of mathematical definition across its whole length, the catenary is warped due to the effects of tension and elasticity in the system. So the simplest description is catenary is the shape made by a chain supporting nothing but its own weight between fixed supports. So in this formulation, each action within the score acts as a link in a chain through which each part progresses to the next articulation, structural articulation, which in this case is like the end of the phrase or the breath. For this to work, it's therefore necessary for all the parts to be kind of in constant contact with each other, doing similar things over a similar process, which is why I also sort of gave this a subtitle, contiguous flux, so everything is connected. So here's an example from this like the very opening bit of the equivocation of time. So we can see that in the strings, they all have one kind of material. The winds have a slightly different kind of material, but they're all moving through similar things across the same span. So despite what kind of looks quite sort of clearly ordered in terms of kind of rhythm and pulse, the aspect of meter is quite obscured by the nature of the material. We've got the glissandi in the winds, which means we can't hear the arrival points of each note. The constant gradual moving of the strings in terms of timbre and moving across the strings from one side to the other. So therefore, the unison element of the material is not what's apparent on the page, but instead consists of this like underlying sinusoid. The strings moving from one side of the instrument and back, which gives an underlying arc to the material and allows for some sense of the passing of time to be transferred across the instruments. As a result of this, it's impossible to give a precise position of the music at any given point in time because there are going to be deviations and fluctuations between the parts until they align at the end of each phrase with the breath. The next term is Brownian time, Brownian temporality, or contained flux, inspired by the thermodynamic movements of particles within a container. So this was in the second section of the work, and there are sort of multiple overlapping systems at work. So here, the flux is determined by the movement between two regions, two harmonic regions that are expressed in the accordion through these two harmonies which act as this container. Within each of these containers, the parts in the other instruments are given loosely notated materials to kind of combine and utilize freely. So there's this sort of intrinsic, internal system with a distributed system of control between everyone except the accordion, where they have autonomy to create and react within certain boundaries. But then there's this external system operated by the accordion, which allows those containers to change. So that's the kind of harmony, just moving backwards and forwards in the accordion at the bottom, and just an example of some of the like inner material in the other parts. So the imitative relationship between the intrinsic material over here, which is quite motivic, and that's used in both structural containers, additionally results in this sort of degree of homogeneity in the texture, and as it accretes, serves to add a third strata and further directionality to the intrinsic material, which is looping below. The intrinsic and extrinsic events are therefore both independent and interdeterminate of each other, affecting the directionality of the other whilst being static within their own domains. Fluvial temporality has a lot of similarities with the quaternal temporality that I talked about before, but differs because the material is non-contiguous. That means everyone has different parts operating at the same time. So the relationships between superimposed material are not defined, and in this case, a starting point and a terminal point are set, with the material for each part moved through freely. Kind of analogous, I guess, to sort of certain elements of free jazz, but here all the material is fully notated rather than improvised. The model for this is, as the name suggests, kind of like a river with kind of water falling upstream and taking many paths down to sea level. Although the system could be interpreted with an almost absolute freedom in terms of the non-relation of material, so making everything just completely free. Some degree of constraint or shaping of the material towards a desired effect is possible, which I did using like stratifications of register and what I consider like a harmonic scaffold, which is really just sort of thinking, not quite in terms of tonal centers, but imagining like an underlying harmony to which the material in the upper parts kind of has a tension relation with. So you kind of, the material you can almost imagine it be operating as ornamentation above a harmony, and then you remove the underlying harmony. What's left is this sort of texture above. The model for synchronic time is that of pendular or mechanical resonance. So this is the phenomena whereby kinetic energy is periodically transferred between a series of undamped pendulums. As a result, over time, these converge upon a common frequency of oscillation as they begin to synchronize with one another. In the context of the equivocation of time, each instrument and its material operates like its own musical pendulum. In order for this to work effectively, it's necessary to initiate the system with chaotic relationships between the musical pendula. So that means instigating at different times, at different speeds. It's also necessary, or at least helpful, to have some degree of equivalence in the type of music between them, so for the material to be clearly periodic and similar, comparable between parts. So for this, I've kind of got a very simple version of the the motif at the top and different iterations of that from the other parts lower down. So each box is occupied by sort of some variation upon this shape. The variation or deviance becomes an important factor in the mechanics of the structure as it actually counteracts the acts as like impedance against the resonance of the system. If everyone had the same motif at a different time, it would too quickly converge. So this kind of offers a way of controlling that flow. Introducing numerous variations and distortions of the motivic material whilst at the same time requiring the musicians to synchronize, introduces a kind of paradoxical condition whereby full synchronization can never occur. So again, the musicians are all free to select between what any of their boxes, which means they're never going to be playing exactly the same thing. However, as this becomes more aligned through a process of entrainment, a change in state is perceived, which again signals the passage of time. The final part, kinesthetic temporality, is thinking about, is thinking about movement as controlling time. So very quickly, sort of the mechanism for this arises from the string instrument trying to negotiate between different physical constraints on what they're playing. In this case, trying to achieve a balance between bow pressure, finger pressure, and the distance from the bridge of the bow to try and achieve a triple stop, so playing 3 strings at once. But this is because we're changing through those different parameters. It's very unpredictable as to exactly when that will occur, which is why it becomes a spontaneous event that happens in time. Okay, so I've kind of had to skip through quite quickly all the various different things. So I just want to kind of conclude with sort of where I'd like to take this idea from here, which is exploring how to move this idea just beyond the performers and find a way to introduce the audience into participating in their own experiences of time within a shared experience. Becoming sort of more rigorous in the applications of the approach, using more like statistical or stochastic processes. Trying to find a more sort of formal philosophical underpinning for it that uses kind of existing literature on the philosophy of time. And then also considering whether to integrate this into something that also uses sort of electroacoustic methods as a kind of hybrid or cyborg kind of effect. So I'll hand over to questions. Yes.
Hi, thank you. That's awesome. And I want to connect with you after this. Just please send me the presentation because I could not articulate so clearly like all of these different architectures, I guess I would put it. I love how this framework is, I use that intentionally. It reminds me of architecture in a very thoughtful way. I guess my question is about like audience as well as composer performer, like psychological senses of time too, you know what I mean? Because like with storytelling, with performance, with any number of things, and with human memory, you know, the way we perceive events and the way events actually happen in real time, like sometimes they line up, sometimes they align.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of room for individual like reconstructions or perceptions of events in one's own, according to one's own narrative experience of the piece, according to the form of the piece and maybe some proportions of the piece, like what's perceived as fast, what's perceived as slow, any number of things. So like, if you could talk a bit about just like, maybe those psychological aspects.
Yeah, I mean, it's not something that I really kind of worked into this methodology And actually, a lot of this is a way of me reflecting back on the piece after I've written it. So I kind of had an idea of what I was trying to do, and then had spent a lot of time thinking about the words and the systems to kind of describe what I was doing. And so I think what you're talking about is something I became very aware of in the rehearsal process, because it's one thing to kind of set up these systems and sort of introduce these elements of freedom, but I found that I think because everyone does have their own experience of things, it can be very difficult to predict actually what's going to happen within them. And I think there's a tendency when you make that, when you sort of create that space for freedom, there's like a vacuum that very quickly gets filled. So the power, that sort of power dynamic is not, it's never like created or destroyed, it's just transferred to something else. So I felt like when I stepped away from that level of control as a composer, that space just got filled with the traditional hierarchies of the ensemble. So I think in terms of audience as well, I think when you position people as audience and performers, audiences expect to just receive rather than be sort of active in participating. And that's certainly not true of all music, and there's lots of music that sort of works outside of that, particularly in the more experimental tradition. But I think I've got like way off the topic of your question, but I don't know if that's sort of kind of at least giving you a bit of a response to that. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for your presentation. I really find amazing this slide where you showed this timeline where you can go from like duration to, on the other hand, was like then timbre. And I was wondering how this influences maybe your music and organization of other parameters, like, for example, pitch, or yeah, which kind of sounds you choose, or which, yeah, I mean, for rhythm and form, it got a bit clearer, but for the other parameters would be interesting.
And I think in terms of working with acoustic instruments, there's still like a very clear boundary between the different conditions on the different scales. Just, I think by the nature of how they're constructed, how we use them, I'm quite interested in exploring, sort of moving between those different things, like when does a pitch start to turn into a rhythm, or the opposite way, starts to become timbral, doing that sort of fractal thing where sort of you can take something on a large scale and make it smaller and smaller and smaller. Personally, I've always felt that suits using kind of electronics a lot more, because you can really sort of, you can manipulate things in a very different way to try and move between them. And I think I'd be really interested in doing that. That's sort of, I guess, like taking on your idea of like melding that you had between that instruments, but doing it in like a completely different domain, and doing it in like the domain of time, but sort of moving freely between what becomes structural, what becomes timbral, and I think that'd be a really interesting thing to explore.
All right. So yeah, hi everybody, and everybody on the live stream as well, if you're there. Thank you for coming to my talk. It's on distance, distortion, and recontextualisation. So I've just finished a PhD which looks at the use of pre-existing materials in my music through a lens of a fluid continuum of distance. So the whole idea behind the PhD is to add an extra kind of parameter to the discourse around so-called borrowed materials. Yeah, I'm not going to go into the terminology, but yeah, I don't like using the term borrowed materials. I like to use the term use of pre-existing material instead. So the whole point in this presentation is the kind of first airing of some postdoc ideas that I've had post-PhD. So it's looking at just some ideas where I can take this use of distance in terms of theory, musicology, and practice. So in terms of my own music, in terms of analysing other music, and in terms of a kind of a general musicological sense, as opposed to just a practice sense. So, yeah. Distance. This looks at a use... So there's different types of uses of pre-existing material. So we kind of see them normally in discourse of being an audible quotation or something that's pretty much buried within music. But there's a big middle ground between that, and this is where the continuum I'm interested in looks at. So instead of looking at pre-existing material as a composition that uses something which isn't the composition it is taking, it's using another source of music, I'm putting that as on a spectrum. So on one end of the spectrum, there's something similar to the pre-existing material. On the other end of the spectrum, there's something very contrived, something completely different. But there's a middle ground between the two of those. And I refer to this as a continuum. So one end of the spectrum, as I say, is contrived, and the other end is similar. So I refer to these in the terms of distant being the contrived end, and similar being proximate. So we have proximate to the pre-existing material and distant to pre-existing material, and a constant fluid moving continuum between the both. This means that the continuum itself can be static or in motion. So when it's static, it means that the composition placed on this spectrum is always the same similarity or kind of contrivedness to the pre-existing material. If it's in motion, it's changing throughout the piece, so it's kind of getting closer to the pre-existing material, going further away. So I wanted to talk about the ways in which distance is actually used. So there are many ways, obviously, but in this presentation, I'll keep it to two main ones. So it's recontextualisation is one of them. So it's recontextualising, in this instance, historical uses of technique, so kind of medieval musical techniques such as prolation, such as isorhythm, mensural notation, things like that, and recontextualising those within new contexts and measuring a distance between its conventional use and a use in another composition, be it mine as a process of writing music based on that, or be it somebody else's composition which uses these techniques. And also distortion, so that's kind of looking at a multi-dimensional way of distorting this pre-existing material, be it through timbre, texture, or through kind of rhythmic pitch construction, or through kind of logistical spatialization, as we kind of saw a little bit of in yesterday's piece. Just to give a little bit of a theoretical background to recontextualization, I look at Ferdinand de Sauzieur's 1959 look at linguistics, where he fixes two types of language. So there's langue parole, which are, so langue is a fixed set of grammatical rules and social conventions practiced by a community of speakers. So it's kind of static within time. So that's the language, and the language are the conventions of the language itself. So it's like a grand linguistical structure which is complete and independent. Parole, on the other hand, is the independent act of speeching, so it's the speech as opposed to the language itself, which is controlled by the speaker. So it's dependent on langue or an understanding of the convention of a specific language. So to have a parole, you've got to have an understanding of the langue. So an example would be, suppose somebody listens to a word in a language Swahili, for example. That someone does not know Swahili. Swahili, therefore, is the long, the grand structure, which remains intact whether someone knows it or not. But for somebody will have to depend on Swahili as a long to be able to use it in speech. So for somebody to use the parole of Swahili, you need to understand the long of Swahili. So that's the kind of, I don't know, I suppose a simple enough description of it. So in terms of music, I use this in terms of recontextualization, in terms of technique in this instance. So a historical technique would therefore be a long. So let's use an example of prolation for this. Is everybody familiar with prolation? No. So this is a canon, which is used in early music, where each part is the same but unfolds at different rates. So, for example, Ochegham's Missa Prolationum is a whole mass of over half an hour where everything is based on different types of prolations. If I may say, it's one of the best pieces ever written, in my opinion. So we use in this sense. So in context of today's music, or my music, the historical technique itself would be the long, and the way that composer uses it, whether it's me or somebody else, would be the parole. And I'm interested in looking at the distance between that parole, the way the composer uses it in today's context, and the way that the historical convention is used, and looking at the kind of middle space between those and the moving distances, what's proximate to that, what's contrived, and looking at that in terms of concepts such as defamiliarization, which I'll come on to in a minute, and the kind of levels of familiarization and defamiliarization, at least in theory. So distortion, as I just briefly mentioned before, this is more based on the material itself in a piece as opposed to a technique. So I split this further into two ways. So there's actual distortion in terms of process. So that can be, the way I compose at least, being interested primarily in new complexity originally, and then also lots of interest in early music as well, and kind of early music techniques from kind of pre-William Byrd all the way back to Ochegham and John Dunstable and composers like that. I'm interested in this kind of parametrical pitch and rhythmic process of additive density. So we have a primary level where we'll have say a direct quotation of material, then we'd have a secondary level where we'd add grace notes to that. We'd have a tertiary level where we'd add a network of primary density tuplets, then a secondary density tuplet, tertiary density tuplet. So it's kind of stepwise going further away from the original material itself, and use those different and combinations of those different rhythms or different constructions to form the material for the final product of the piece. So that's kind of one element of distortion, and another one is sonic, so through the sound itself. So that's actually based around perceptibility and audibility of the pre-existing source. I understand that perceptibility is a funny one to, and I don't really want to go down the rabbit hole of that, because if I'm to use some pre-existing material which is very unknown to anybody, so say August Normiger's, which I use a piece of August Normiger in a vocal piece of mine, and I presume that the majority of people don't really know who August Normiger is, because I didn't before I found this piece. So perceptibility does depend on kind of, in practice, it depends on the listener's understanding of the piece. So I'm talking about perceptibility in theory. So sonic here is actually through the perceptibility in theory of the pre-existing material itself. So kind of additive timbres, denser textures, dynamics, and kind of logistical spatializations of things. So I'm going to start with somebody who's not me. You'd probably be pleased to know. So Wolfgang Mitterer, Austrian composer, in 2018, he is a composer and producer, so he wrote this kind of remix of Beethoven, of all of his symphonies mashed into one album, which he refers to as a new way of listening to Beethoven, which is fair enough. But this is a kind of the long being the Beethoven symphonies themselves, and his approach being the parole. I'll come back to these terms soon, but this is, in terms of distance, there's three interrelated terms that I'm willing to take my kind of pre-existing research on uses of pre-existing materials further using verfremdungseffect, Ostranenie and deference. Yeah, trilingual quotes there, aren't they? But not bad for an Englishman. So, here we go. Yeah, so this is a kind of very surface level example of recontextualization. So he suggests that this is a new way of listening to Beethoven, but obviously within that there is a sense of how do you measure how close Mitterer's new way of listening is to the original way of listening. So there's a definite kind of continuum between that. Oops, why is this not working now? Oh, where am I going? Ah, there we go. So, Ostranenie verfremdungseffect. So they all relate to defamiliarization in different contexts. So, Ostranenie it was coined by Victor Shklovsky in 1917. Ignore the 1998. I have changed it on this one. I don't know why it says 1998. But yeah, he coined it in 1917. Where he tries to distinguish the poetic from practical language. So there's the kind of practical langue and the poetic parole. And it's this kind of idea of practical versus poetic, and the poetic using elements of defamiliarization from the practical. So he suggests that poetic language is different to the language we use every day. So in context of music and historical technique, it's the conventional use of historical technique versus an adapted use. So it's, convention versus adaptation. So we can take this theory further to explore music which can recontextualize these conventions from the past. Similarly, Verfremdungseffect is Bertolt Brecht's estrangement effect, which is practically a translation of Ostranenie, which is the Russian version of it. But it begins to link to my theory of distance in slightly wider contexts. So Brecht suggested this as being a distance between the character and the actor playing the character. So it's, again, that middle space between actor and character, where one becomes an alienation of the other. So they always refer, both Shklovsky and Brecht refer to this as a defamiliarization. So it's viewing things out of a context, out of a conventional context, or what we may perceive as a conventional context, to cause a sense of defamiliarization. I want to take this a little bit further in this kind of research, because I don't think defamiliarization itself is a binary thing, familiar or defamiliar. Again, it's this continuum of levels of defamiliarization. And I think this is what I'm trying to get at with the music I write, is using a constantly moving continuum and fluid continuum of levels of defamiliarization, using aspects of recontextualization and distortion or obscuration to form processes of composition, and to also analyze other composers' music which use pre-existing materials. So, différence. This was coined by Jacques Derrida in 1967, which is a slightly more precise way to describe what I'm talking to, but still not quite there. So the term holds a double meaning, so it's the difference of meaning or deferral of meaning. Let me just get all them up, why not? So the relationship between how text becomes meaning, which is a separation of both. So there is a distance between text and meaning depending on how one deploys the language. So there's a difference between composition and use of pre-existing material depending on how the composer deploys that use of pre-existing material. And that's always changing depending on the approach and depending on various levels of perception as well. So it's not an exact relationship. However, this is something that can be applied to use of pre-existing material and stems from Derrida. So one of these ways is how does the composer, or one of these questions that this could possibly ask is, how does the composer's use of pre-existing material relate to the original source in terms of historical convention? And also, how is this use of pre-existing material applied to some sort of potential continuum between reapplication, adaptation, recontextualisation, and recomposition? So kind of taking what Dan showed with the anarchist spectrum in the previous lecture, we can have a continuum of replication, adaptation, contextualisation, recontextualisation and recomposition, which is this kind of fluidity of levels of defamiliarisation and distance, which I should add, defamiliarisation could become, depending on how this research goes, the defamiliarisation could become another term for distance. We'll see. So again, there are two ways, definitely amongst more, but two ways in which this can be applied. So to the musical material itself, so it's what I talked through about distortion through the sound and process of derivations of material, and to the historical techniques of recontextualisation, so the deviation away from the historical use, so a kind of ontological confrontation between two times or contexts. So we'll go on to a little bit of music. De Rerum Naturis is a piece I wrote in 2021, I think, for a solo percussionist. So the idea behind this piece was to have, so the piece does have a one-pitch percussion instrument, which is a glockenspiel, and that uses a quotation of a plain chant all the way through. So it uses a singular cell of a quotation with unrelated, unpitched percussion material, and then another cell of another singular cell of quotation, pitch quotation, and then more unpitched percussion material, which is unrelated. And the idea behind this was to compose with distance depending on time. So my idea was the more time between a singular quotation, the further the distance from the original material, if that makes sense. And the kind of less time, the more proximate to the material, because it's repeated quicker, so you kind of get a sense of the melodic line unfolding in the glockenspiel. So yeah, the structure is split into 33 subsections, each of which have different lengths and changing lengths, and each subsection is opened by a strike of the glockenspiel, which is a singular pitch quotation. So this was at a time where it was very kind of, I used a lot of very precise and processual ways of producing material. And I wanted to move a little bit away from that, to be a little bit more creative in myself and to actually be more fluid. So after writing the piece, I analysed the decisions I made to see how intuitive. Sorry, I should say that the non-pitch material is completely freely composed. So I reanalysed the piece after looking at how I actually compose these things. And I found that the three main techniques that we use were canons, isorhythms, and prolations, all of them related to medieval music. So this is where this kind of thinking behind recontextualisation it stems from. I don't want to dwell on this too much because I've got quite a lot to get through. And but here's an example of an isorhythm in the top part. You can see the isorhythm unfolding in the lower, on the lower stems on the top stave, but through. Sorry, and on the two different isorhythms on the upper stem and the lower stem. Yeah, in the red bracket. Yeah, I'll carry on going. And here's a kind of derivation of a registral canon, so it's not using exact canonic technique, but it kind of shows a further distance for using canon. This is kind of derived from a canon. You can see how the canons work slightly. Yeah, as that the excerpt in the red bracket goes. I'll just play a little bit of this piece. Here we go. Hashtag electronic, hashtag trip hop. Who'd have thunk? I move on to some Dave Gorton now. So David Gorton is an English composer, writes quite sweet music. But his Lacrimae Variations of 2014 is what I think of a decomposition. So it's very surface level, and the whole process of this decomposition pretty much is the piece. But he takes John Dowland's Lacrimae Variations, Flow My Tears, which is quite a well-known piece, and he gradually decomposes that and distorts that using additive parametrical distortions such as microtonal additions, kind of augmentation, diminution. It's the kind of it's a lovely piece, but it's very surface level, and it's quite a simple example of what I mean by this being a spectrum. But here it is. So. Where the Dowland is. Take the last variation. Yeah, back to old Wolfgang Mitterer. Again, this is another obvious example, but it's a little bit more fluid than the Gorton because each movement is done in a theme of variation. So each movement, as the variations go on, each variation becomes more distorted. So in the Mitterer, it's still obvious, and you can still see that you can see what he's doing, but it's much more fluid as the piece goes on than the Gorton. So he uses three ways. So he uses electronic processing, he uses lots of layering, he uses lots of different ways of using reference, and yeah, for the perceptibility of the piece he uses, which is Telemann's Wassermusik. So here we go. We go from the beginning. you get the idea. Again, both of these pieces, the kind of perceptibility of both the pre-existing materials are quite noticeable, but they are examples of kind of surface level ways of distorting material. Now on to Richard Barrett. So we've had two lectures that talk about Brian Ferneyhough today, which I'll never complain about. So I thought I'd add a little bit of Richard Barrett, which is another composer part of this so-called New Complexity group. So Vanity is a big orchestral piece from 1990 to 1994. And it's very dense, it's wonderful. But there is a direct quotation of Schubert's Death of the Maiden Quartet, which just appears out of nowhere and the piece ends. I'll show you in a second, but it just makes the listener want to re-listen to the whole piece again with that in mind. So you hear the end of the piece and then you want to re-listen because where the hell did that Schubert come from? He describes it as being a peregrination of the pitches that make up the piece, which I think is a beautiful description, suggesting that all the materials are so far apart, they're so distant to the Schubert. So yeah, I'll show you an example. There you go. So that's an example of just a shift from one end of being completely contrived or distant to moving to being completely audible and proximate to the original quotation. I realise that I'm running out of time, so I'll talk about my string quartet and then miss out what else I was going to talk about and then talk about yesterday's piece. So just a quick one on my string quartet. Unfortunately, this hasn't had a recording yet because it was written as an exercise for the PhD and not with a performance in mind. But it was inspired by the meeting between Brahms and Grieg. And part of the quote when Grieg was talking about Bach was that suddenly a mist fell from my eyes, blah, 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 blah. I can't remember the rest of the quote. But that's where the quote of this, the title of this piece comes from. And I intertwine uses of material from Grieg, which are always contrived, always distant to the original use, and the kind of pitch materials from Peer Gynt, different movements of Peer Gynt, and a technical use that Brahms uses in Geistliches Lied, the vocal piece, choral piece, which the whole piece is composed upon double canons at the minor ninth. So this piece is composed using double canons at the minor ninth. So the mist falling from one's eye is the double canons being very imperceptible at the beginning. Nobody knows that the double canons, they're just very far distant derivatives of double canons, and then they kind of go back down, similar in the way that it does in the Barrett, but less visibly, to the piece ending with double canons at the minor ninth, as you can see. See on the top system, there is a double canon at the minor ninth. So yeah, these canons just kind of filtrate back down to being visible on the score. It's not a double canon, sorry, it's just a single canon at the minor ninth, but yeah. I will miss my choral piece, but I will talk about yesterday's piece very quickly. So yeah, Moiré is based upon moiré patterns, so the kind of photographical technique of where you overlay similar images in different contexts to create some sort of optical illusion. So it kind of causes interference between the images, which means that the more images you layer on top of each other, the more distorted the original image is. And the fewer images, the less distorted. So that's the that's what I wanted to do. So in terms of sonic distortion, the piece's material is used that uses the lament from Carissimi's Jefter, which is, if you don't know, is one of the most beautiful pieces ever written. I'm saying that a lot today, aren't I? But it is. It's really sweet and very sad as well. So 3 trios. So this is why I split the piece into 3 trios. Each trio has a different level of distortion to the Carissimi. And whenever the Carissimi's distortion in one trio is very low, i.e. it's very proximate to the original material, the other trios kind of overpower that in terms of timbral density, textural density, and kind of volume. So it's the idea that depending on where you're sitting, you might hear the Carissimi in one way, and if you're sitting closer to the ensembles, to the trios which don't, which are distorting the other ensemble, then you'll hear the distortion more. So it's the kind of multi-dimensionality of distortion through different ways and means. So yeah, the intention was to have the kind of drift in and out of focus of this of the moire of the Carissima material, like a moire pattern, kind of constantly moving up and down, approaching audibility but never quite achieving it. So that's how it works. As you can see in trio 1 on the top of the stave, the 3 top instruments, harp, violin, and alto sax. There is a direct quotation in the alto sax, but you've got this thing in the bottom trio which distorts it from the beginning, which means you can never really get back into it after. So yeah, same here. And at the yeah. So this is where all the ensembles are kind of very far and very distant from the original. So yeah, some references from today's talk. I think it's a matter of just saying that this is the kind of wanting to take this further in musicological and analytical and practical context to kind of talk about, to add an important, what I think is an important other kind of facet of the discourse around using pre-existing materials in music, this idea of distance and similarity and contrivedness. So thank you very much. Thanks for listening. The score of yesterday's piece is on here if you want to look through it as well. Thank you. Any questions? Outside. No question.
Question, but quickly.
Okay, yeah. It's just there.
So I was just wondering if you have any idea of how much further you can take this idea, like what the sort of ultimate extreme of this would be.
Yeah, I think this is what I'm exactly trying to find myself. Is this is the starting point. I'm trying to see how extreme this could go. How far can these continua go? What happens when the composition falls off either side of the continuum? What if it actually morphs into something at one end? What if it falls completely out of the other end? So it's so contrived. It's yeah, it's
Well, it's kind of in that vein. If I've understood everything correctly, you use one particular bit of pre-existing material for each piece.
what? Sorry.
For each piece of yours, you're referencing one piece of pre-existing material.
No, the string quartet I don't.
Is that multiple ones?
So I've got the Brahms.
Oh, Brahms and Grieg, that's
Brahms
right,
and Grieg.
yes.
So
yeah.
I normally do just reference one piece of material, but again, this is another thing where you can just reference so many and...
Yeah, well, I was wondering, if you sort of layer like so many materials on top of each other.
I think I have done that, actually. Or maybe I haven't. I forget, everything morphs into one now. But yeah, it's looking at those different ways in which I can actually just take it to the furthest extreme as possible. Because I think there's something that warrants that extremity, but it's a matter of finding it. Yeah.
In that case, how do you measure distance between 2 points rather than just the one fixed point? Because surely, like, there's an element where you become distant from one, but there's potential to move closer to the other.
Yeah, but I think that's the interesting thing, because I think being proximate to one and distant to the other creates a further spectrum where it kind of changes and defines a middle ground between other extremities.
Yeah.
So I think by doing that and by kind of compiling fighting structures and whatever on top of each other like that, or concepts, then you actually find further things which are results of that. So I think that's all something which sounds really interesting to explore. But yeah.
Yep.
Cool. Thank you.